Welcome. Today we're going to discuss the technique Snapping Twig and some of the ways in which we can relate it to other techniques in the American Kenpo system. Now keep in mind that this is not designed to be a full comprehensive list, far from it, and it's not supposed to be family groupings. Rather, it's different ways in which you can explore the technique and ways to relate it to other techniques in the American Kenpo system. So let's start out with some of the important concepts or things that we're doing with Snapping Twig. In this case, ratcheting. So the easiest way to think about ratcheting is when we turn or use a pivot point to then use the opposite end of the weapon to deliver a strike or a maneuver. So in this case, I just demonstrated two. We used the long range as a pivot point so that I can deliver the short range weapon, and then the short range weapon was a pivot point so that I can use the long range part of the weapon. So let's take a look at Snapping Twig and how we can relate it to other techniques through ratcheting. So if we take a look at the end of the technique, we're using the hammer fist and then turning that into a pivot point so that we can deliver the elbow. So this is done on the high zone. So now let's move that to the middle zone. We get something like gathering clouds, where we're doing the same concept by doing long range with the hand and then wrapping around with the elbow. So if you notice, it's doing the same thing we did here. It's just doing it in the middle zone. So now let's do the opposite of that. Instead of using the long range as the pivot point, let's use the short range as the pivot point. So this would give us something like obscure claws, where we do the elbow and then the heel bump. But the interesting thing to notice is that the elbow is actually not being used as a strike, but rather as a positional cover. So you don't always have to use the weapon as a strike. We can use it for positioning before using the ratchet. So now that we've done it with our hands, let's take this concept and do it with our feet, because anything we can do with our hands, we can do with our feet. So let's do something like falling cross, where we're going to be taking the opponent and again, going from a short to a long, we're going to use the knee as the pivot point so that we can ratchet with the foot. But just like we did with the hands, we can do the opposite of that. So if we take a look at something like attacking mace, we can now do the long range with the foot and then using the knee as the ratchet so that we can deliver the lock or the buckle. But just like we did obscure claws, the foot doesn't have to be used as a strike. So if we take a look at something like Dance of Death, where we take the opponent down, we're using the step through to put our foot where we want, which is the long range, so that we can then use the knee as the ratchet part to lock up the opponent. So now that we talked about ratchets, let's move on to another concept. Foot maneuvers. We have a saying that says foot maneuvers are done as needed. So the interesting part about that is that typically we think about adding foot maneuvers, but there's actually three things that we can do. We can add foot maneuvers, we can delete foot maneuvers, or we can modify a foot maneuver. So let's start out with Snapping Twig. If you take a look at Snapping Twig, what we're doing is we're hitting with a long range, and then I want to hit with a short range. But what happens? I can't reach because we're going from long to short. So what do I need to do? Well, typically add a foot maneuver. So this is why the technique has a built-in added foot maneuver. But remember, we can delete them. What if I was really good and I pulled him and now he's this close? Well, if I hit him, I don't have to do the foot maneuver. So I might even have to delete the hammer fist and go straight for the elbow. So let's look at this again from a different perspective, deflecting hammer. So deflecting hammer is doing the same concept. I'm going to pull him in and then deliver the elbow. So again, we're going from a long range to a short range. So the technique has a built-in foot maneuver. But just like in Snapping Twig, if I'm really good or he's really committed, I no longer need to add that foot maneuver. So I am deleting a foot maneuver. So let's look at something where we can add a foot maneuver. Let's look at the opposite. Do something like intellectual departure. Intellectual departure, the kick's coming in, we kick, and we set up to do this back knuckle. But again, what if I'm really good? I hit him with the back kick, and boom, he goes flying. Well, I no longer have this back knuckle. So I have to add a foot maneuver. I can do my cross and hit him, or in the case of intellectual departure, usually we reverse the sequence. We actually add the foot maneuver with the foot and then do the hand. So now that we did that, let's look at a way to modify it. And in this case, use something like hugging pendulum. So if we take a look at hugging pendulum, we're doing 2 foot maneuvers. One at the beginning for the defense, where I step back, and then a full crossover so I can get to this leg to do the kick. But again, in this case, let's assume I'm not good, but we have to consider the environment. Remember, consideration number 1 is the environment. What if there's a wall behind me? What if I don't have the room to step back? So what if I just have to do this like deflecting hammer, where I just step? Well, I can't do the crossover anymore. So I might have to, again, delete the foot maneuver and just do the kick. Or I modify it and I only do a drag or a slide up to get to the kick. So the way to think about the foot maneuvers, again, is you can add foot maneuvers, delete them, or modify them. And obviously throughout the techniques, you'll see that some of them are added, and there's places which you can modify or delete. And this is all based on consideration number 1, the environment. How big are you in relationship to your opponent? How committed are they? What is around you? So now that we're done with the foot maneuvers, let's do one more way to relate snapping twig. This is going to be through the shape of the crane. So if you notice, in snapping twig, we have this shape of the crane. But how are we using it? We're using it as a frictional pull to get our opponent closer to us. So let's relate this to something like hooking wings or fatal cross, where we're doing the double version of that. And it just depends whether you're doing the foot or the middle knuckles to follow it. But is that the only way we can use the shape of the crane? As pulls? Well, no, we can also use them as strikes. So if we take a look at something like trigger salute, we're now using this as a strike. But if you notice, we're using the inside of the crane to do the strike. We can then do the opposite of that in something like a raining lance, where we end up hitting with the top of the crane to deliver the strike. But is that the only way we can do it, with the inside and the outside? Well, no, we still have our fingers. So if we take a look at something like unwinding pendulum, you're now delivering the strike with the fingers. So just to recap, the ways in which we related snapping twig to other techniques in the American Kenpo system was through the shape of the crane, through the concept of foot maneuvers are done as needed, and through the first concept that we talked about, which was ratcheting. We hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system a little bit better. Thank you very much.